Public-private partnerships. How can PPPs deliver better services? Project structuring and designing the PPP contract.
Hello, I'm Jane Jimmerson, and I'm here in Johannesburg with Emmanuel Nerankindi, who leads IFC's PPP transaction advisory work. So Emmanuel, we've worked together on a number of PPP transactions.
Yes, we have.
And it's designing PPP contracts is part of the course that we're learning this week. Can you tell me, we use the term transaction structuring a lot. How would you define that for our audience?
Thank you, Jen. I would say that transaction structuring is a process whereby both parties in a public-private partnership, which is the public party and the private party, are engaged in a process of defining the risks, the rights, and the responsibilities that come with each party. This is done through a process that is first led by the public side, where they go through a process of a legal, a financial, a technical, and an economic due diligence. This is to enable the public party, which runs a tender, to understand the project and to understand which risks come with the project, which benefits come with the project, and then to assign them between the public party and the private party. This is done through a contract. The contracts are designed to be of a longer nature. They are typically between 20 and 30 years. And so quite a number of things can be predetermined. But as with any other long-term arrangement, there might be instances where events come up that neither party could have foreseen. For example, if you have a water PPP where a private operator is providing drinking water to a country, and we have a number of those transactions that have been structured by ourselves, there could be a drought. That is an unforeseen event that can't be planned for in terms of predicting when it will happen, but the consequences can be quite stark. And both parties need to be clear who will bear what responsibility should that happen. So it is critical for both parties to try as much as possible to envisage the unexpected and then to make arrangements for what would happen should they eventuate.
So you've touched really on the risks and responsibilities of a project, but you also have to highlight, I think in a PPP transaction, what is the service standard? What are we asking the private sector to do?
Correct. So essentially defining a service standard, Jane, is saying what will be done, to what quality levels it will be done, and then again, who will do it in most cases, which will be the private sector operator. So I'd like to maybe illustrate that using an example of a port project that we as IFC advised the government of Benin on. So in Benin, the government has a quite strategic asset, which is the port. The port serves the country, and the port also serves the neighboring countries. And essentially, the challenge with that port is that traffic was not being handled as quickly as it could be. So the port was not competitive compared to neighboring ports. And what the government then wanted to do was to get a private operator who would invest in a container terminal, but put in equipment that was of of a modern enough nature and of an efficient enough nature that it would speed up the processing time. So armed with a grant that the government had received from the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the government built modern infrastructure, which was a key. And then the government sought a private operator, international private operator as it turned out, to invest in equipment that, as I said, would then speed up the processing of traffic that came through this container terminal and also through the port. And so then the government was able to provide a competitive service compared to neighboring ports.
Okay, so it's interesting that we use the example of Benin, because we've also worked on a water project in Benin that we structured as a PPP, but it was a very, very different nature, but still had the same key elements of defining the service that was required. So Benin has a process of delegated management of small-scale water schemes where villages and small towns, small water systems are built and then handed over to the local private sector to operate. Now, this has been the process for maybe around 10 years. So what we did, we were asked to help the government pilot a number of more in-depth PPP transactions. So we worked with them to develop a new form of contract to strengthen the private sector engagement and improve the quality of service. So the definition of the performance standard was for the private operator, firstly, to take over small existing systems, continue to manage those. But also within the first 2 years, they had to extend coverage, so improve the quality of service, install household connections to around 80% of the population. So that's how we defined the service standard in that case. It's interesting, in both transactions, the important thing was that we defined what we wanted the private sector to do.
Yes.
We didn't tell them how to do it.
Absolutely.
Because they are they're the experts in the field, they are the deliverer of services, they know much better how to provide water or how to manage a container terminal than we or the government, as their advisors or the government has. So it's important to have a standard of what we want, but not to be too prescriptive about how we're going to deliver that.
Fully agree, Jane. So we've talked about service standards and them being critical for public-private partnerships and transaction structuring. I think another key element that I spoke to earlier is the one about ensuring there's a financial equilibrium and sustainability of a project. Staying with the port project that we did in Benin, we were quite determined to ensure that the government would be able to structure this transaction in a manner that was financially sustainable. And so, as I mentioned, the government had a significant grant from the Millennium Challenge Corporation that it was able to invest in modern infrastructure in the Key. Therefore, that meant that the government did not need to ask a private operator to come and invest significant sums of money. In the case of the port, again, what was done is that the private operator, we had done the kind of traffic studies that made us convinced, as the government, that the traffic was sufficient, if priced correctly, for the private operator to recover whatever amounts they invested in. And so this is a great example of a public financial investment and a private financial investment leading into a situation where the project itself is financially sustainable and becomes a basis for competing with neighboring ports.
So it's interesting, we dealt with that issue slightly differently in the Benin water project. So in the port sector, in West Africa, people have a choice of what port they use.
Yep.
So they could go to different ports. So the tariff is a competitive price,
Yep.
and can be and is regulated through competition. With water, it's very different. The water is a natural monopoly, so people don't have a choice of the several different water providers. They have to use the service provided there. So we looked at the cost of water. What were people paying for their water? And it turned out that the people in the rural areas were actually paying more for their water than the urban areas. And these are the poorest parts of the country. So the decision was made that we couldn't allow the tariff to be set by the private sector, that we would fix the tariff at its current rate, and that any revenues would have to be based on the current tariff and change for inflation over time, but it would stay the same in real terms. So we looked at the sort of financial equilibrium of the project. How much would we expect the private sector to revenue we would expect the private sector to generate from that tariff, and the amount of water people were expected to use, even with the expanded coverage. And then we looked at how much investment was required for each of these systems to rehabilitate the existing system and reach the targets we'd set, so 80% household coverage. And we found that the two didn't balance, that the revenue wasn't sufficient to cover all of the investment in the system. So the government chose to put in a grant, part of its own budget allocation, to the capital investment for the project. So in the first 2 years, while the investment was being made to improve the network, there could be a grant that goes towards that. So the question is, how did we make sure there was value for money for that grant, and that we were getting the best value for government? So in the bidding process, we asked the operators to bid against two things. Firstly, their construction costs, so the cost of the investment to reach the service level that we required. And secondly, how much was the private sector willing to invest? We had an idea from our market sounding and from our financial analysis, but we wanted them to really say how much they were able to invest. So we took cost of construction and the cost of the percentage that they were willing to finance, and the result would be the least cost to government. And that's what we used as a bidding parameter, so that helped incentivize the private sector to offer value for money for the government. So that's how we integrated a grant component for the capital investment, and yet still leveraging private sector efficiency.
So two very distinct projects, both dealing with the issue of sustainability in a completely different manner because of the nature of the industry, which I think is an important lesson. So maybe, Jane, the third critical thing that we've discussed that is important for structuring is being very clear about the roles and the risks and the responsibilities of the parties. Again, in the port project that I mentioned earlier, for the private operator, we were quite clear what they were going to be responsible for. So one clear responsibility was the investing responsibility. That company was required to invest 115 million United States dollars in infrastructure that, again, as I said, was required to be to bring efficiency in the way they handled imports and exports in the container terminal. So an investing responsibility. A very clear responsibility to pay royalty payments to the government for the benefit of being the operator, and also a clear obligation to remain an investor for at least 5 years. The international operator would be part of the shareholding structure of the company that was running the container terminal. So very clear responsibilities for the private operator. On the government side, the government had obligations to ensure that it provided all the rights and permits that the private operator would require to do their business, and also critically that should the PPP come to an end prematurely, that the government would then pay any termination payments that would be required under the contractual arrangements that have been signed between the two parties. In addition, there is a port regulator who was a party to the contract. And what was agreed between the parties was that the port operator would ensure that there was dredging that was undertaken to ensure clear access to ships within so that they would come to the container terminal that the private operator was running. So just to conclude, Jen, I would say that the three key things that we need to get right in any PPP arrangement are the ones that we've just gone through. The roles, responsibilities, and rights of the various parties. We need to be very clear about performance and service standards, and we need to ensure that there is a financial sustainability and a financial equilibrium that ensures that these projects are viable for the private operator and affordable for the government.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been an Open Learning Campus presentation brought to you by the World Bank Group, accelerating solutions through learning.